Today we're talking about the top 7 worst gods of Season 6. We're going to talk about 7 gods specifically because the last 3 gods are so close together that their positions are basically interchangeable depending on your exact interpretation of what makes a bad god, so I wanted to make sure to include them all. Now, in order to talk about a list like this, we first have to figure out which components, which aspects of a god's performance are important to be considered a bad god. And to me, the aspects that I found most important were the performance across ranked, specifically the higher levels of ranked, but not entirely excluding lower levels. So anything gold and above, and especially the region around platinum and diamond, I'd say is very relevant for a god's performance. Masters and grandmasters usually, unfortunately, have too small of a sample size to really be considered. And along with that, of course, the performance in competitive. I wanted to look primarily at the most recent statistics, but in order for a god to qualify as a bad god in general for this season, they of course have to be generally bad throughout the year. But if there's a brief period where a god performs decently because the meta favors them very much and they perform poorly otherwise, I would still say they could be a bad god. Another thing that I have to mention, of course, is that this is personal opinion. I base this very much on the statistics, but depending on how you want to look at certain numbers or put more weight on certain numbers than others, you could come to a different conclusion. Also, these stats focus purely on conquest. Ranked and competitive is something that you can still somewhat compare, even though that is hard enough. But if you try to factor in more casual modes like Joust or Arena or something, it will completely mess up the stats because the gods perform completely differently there. With that, let's begin with spot number 7. And again, spot number 5 to 7 are very interchangeable. Spot number 7 goes to Nemesis. Now, Nemesis has not really done much throughout the year. Across all ranks, she's currently sitting at a 46% win rate. In gold, it's roughly 46, and in diamond, it's roughly 45. She has a bit of a spike in her win rate in platinum, and that's really the only thing that saves her from being lower, where she seems to be played by one player specifically that performs very well with her, I'm guessing, because she doesn't have a lot of games, but she has a 53% win rate there. That doesn't deter from the fact that her overall slash line is very bad. In Masters, she's actually in the top 3 worst gods right now, and in competitive, it looks no different. She, like any other pick on this list actually, was not picked at Worlds at all, and even looking at the stats across the year, she was played a total of 12 times and banned 9 times, which is already a bad sign when you have a god that specifically is supposed to counter tanks and they're hardly even banned. And out of those 12 games, she won 4, giving her a 33% win rate. When a god is already only picked in very favorable situations, you'd expect them to at least do well then. As to why that's happening, I think a major reason for Nemesis is that certain itemization path that allowed her burst builds to work better have been kind of trimmed down, and without that, she needs very specific metas to work very well. She either needs a meta where basic attack focused builds work very well, which is not the case for melees at the moment, or she needs a meta with strong CC immunity items, so her bubble is not easily countered, her deflect is not easily countered, and right now she doesn't really have anything that stands out for her, so that's why I think her performance is dropped off. The next one on the list is probably relatively unsurprisingly Loki. Loki has not had a hot year. He can kinda save himself a little bit with some of his win rate in ranked because he gets at least an okay performance in gold. In other levels of play, he's around 48% win rate, 49% win rate sometimes even, so it depends a lot on who is playing him as well. His overall win rate in ranked is still 47.76%, so it could be worse. But then realistically, we also have to look at the competitive side, and here Loki was simply not valued enough to be picked or banned at all for the entire year. And at the end of the day, that's the difference between him and Nemesis. Nemesis does a little bit worse in ranked, but at least she's considered in competitive sometimes, even though she often does poorly there too. Whereas Loki does slightly better in ranked, but is not even considered, not even looked at in competitive at all, ever. I will not go into detail as to why he performs the way he performs right here, because I've discussed him very recently. If you want to check out that video, I will try and remember to link it right here, so you can hear more about Loki specifically. Spot number 5 honestly was a little bit of a surprise to me. I did not expect this god to do this poorly, but here we are. This one goes to Sun Wukong. Because talking about competitive and gods being picked, Sun Wukong was picked 6 times in this entire year, and he managed to win a whopping 0% of those games. His ranked win rate is okay with 48% on average and somewhat slightly above 50% in gold specifically. He's still far from a strong god and he's significantly below 50% in most other divisions. A big reason behind Sun Wukong's performance is that currently solo lane is very insular and the goal is mostly to farm and do your 1v1 stuff to then have a big impact in late game and not so much focused on bullying in the early game. And Sun Wukong is the opposite of that. He's an early game bully and doesn't do all that much in late game. Spot number 4 goes to one that personally pains me to say, and it will pain many of you. Because this one goes to Kuzenbo. Kuzenbo is not doing too hot in anything right now, really. In ranked, he has a win rate of 45.64% across all ranks, and he does okay in Diamond with a 49.61% win rate, which is actually surprisingly high, but in every other division, his win rate is significantly below 50%. In Platinum, it even falls below 45%. He was not picked at the World Championship at all and only 8 times throughout the year with a win rate of 25%. He won 2 competitive games and that's it. So in that regard, and when it comes to ranked, he did worse than Nemesis. When it comes to the reasons, I think part of it is that Hi-Rez just wants him to be a meme character and doesn't really care that much about him being high in the meta. And on the other hand, I think part of it is that his 1 isn't necessarily the most useful ability and that his entire kit just works better in a meta where you, for example, can often run into dual hunter comps or something. His setup isn't the best, and even him causing disruption requires a lot more effort than other gods, because even to get a single target out you often have to use Blink, and it's too easy for the enemy to simply ignore you and just not attack you when you do your reflect as well. Spot number 3 is likely the most controversial one on this list, because this guy actually had a bit of a competitive showing for a while, and that is Thoth. The problem with Thoth is that he was effective in one particular meta, which was the meta revolving around ethereal stuff, often combined with Pythagoras piece as well, this health stacking mage meta. So technically during this meta he should have been super effective because all the items worked in his favor. But his overall win rate in competitive, despite that, for this year, between 44 games played, is still just 41%, which is very low when you have a god that's already in such a favored situation. And this briefly applicable strategy was countered by Hi-Rez by changing Heartseekers so that it would specifically counter that type of health stacking, making it easier for assassins to still burst him down. As a result of that, he was not seen at the Smite World Championship at all, not even banned. And he was never performing well outside of competitive in the first place and sits at a 44.51% win rate across all ranked levels at the moment. In gold it's at 45%, in platinum it's at 47% roughly, and even in diamond, where he should do better, he only gets to 49.6%. When it comes to the reasons, again, a lot of it is down to his specific build path that was found from this season being countered, and now all mages having more mobility in the first place. Through Doom Orb, the benefit of Thoth is more limited. Everyone is a little bit more agile, so the extra agility that Thoth has over others doesn't stand out as much. His build style often also favors CDR, which you don't necessarily get as easily as with some older builds with a new build style. The issue with Thoth has always been that he usually does very well in competitive and relatively poorly in ranked, because he does so much in a coordinated team, but now he can't even really fulfill that anymore. And the same issue has plagued our god in spot number 2 for a very long time. And that's Janus. Now Janus is in some regards a bit of a different story, because we have to give him that even though he is a god that only works in competitive, he still actually does work in competitive sometimes. Over the year he's been picked 19 times and won 12 of those games, giving him a 63% win rate. But none of these were at the end of the year. He did not get picked up at the Smite World Championship at all, and his win rate in ranked is absolutely atrocious. So atrocious in fact that he is the worst god across all ranks with a 41.88% win rate, which is almost 1% lower than the next god and more than 2% lower than the god after that. With the exception of Masters and Grandmasters, again, a very small sample size, the win rate of Janos never makes it past rank 100 in any division. So what is his problem? He is too complex for some players. He requires a lot of coordination with your team to work most effectively, and that's something that makes him stronger in competitive, which prevents him from being buffed in casual or ranked, basically. And he also doesn't really come with a big team fight ultimate like many other mages that are favored at the moment. And we're in a late game meta, and Janos isn't necessarily a super late game god. While he can kind of dropship the ult towards the enemy Titan, that's pretty much his biggest deal at that point, whereas other ultimates can be team fight turning way more than Janos can. Before we get to number 1, we have a lot of honorable mentions to make here. Persephone is basically performing very poorly in ranks, but she is feared in competitive, and different from Janos, she's not just picked a few times across the year, she is picked and banned a lot. So this is a case of just a very high skill cap, but in the right hand she's very strong. The similar situation is true for Set. He also performed very well in the games leading up to Worlds, but then interestingly enough was not picked and only once banned at Worlds. So he was kind of more in the qualifiers for Worlds, where he was on the other hand very strong. So a very interesting situation with him. His problem right now is that he just got a nerf that nerfed his skewer cooldown to 8 seconds instead of 7, and that drastically hit his win rate across pretty much all levels of play except the highest. So he is performing worse now, and if this were his stats all the time, then I would say he would be on this list, but this is a recent development, and before that, at least in competitive, he was very strong, and even in ranked he was farming for a while. Aposh most certainly is a god, but at Worlds he was picked twice, and he also had a 52% win rate across the year, so was picked, he was still pretty successful, giving him overall a bit more value than someone like Janos in my eyes, who did not get picked at Worlds at all. Our rework gods, Bastet and Odin, may not be the best performers in competitive, but that doesn't stop them from performing decently to good in certain levels of ranked at least, so they will not be making the list either. And King Arthur, while not performing very well right now, did have his time early in the season, so I wouldn't say that he was bad overall in this year. Freya also had her ups and downs throughout the year, so we can't really say she was bad all the time. And that brings us to god number 1. The worst god of this year didn't surprise me, but it may surprise some of you if you are primarily playing other modes that are not Conquest, and that is Nox. I know Nox is frustrating to play against, but statistically speaking, she is absolutely terrible at the moment. In terms of competitive, she was also not picked at the World Championship. Across the year, she was picked 6 times, not once banned, and she lost all of those games. But different from other gods here that just don't show up in competitive, she also doesn't show up in ranked either. Across all ranks, her win rate is 44.13%, only Janos and Persephone are worse in that regard. And especially towards higher levels of ranked, she is always right behind Janos. In Platinum, she is the 2nd worst god after Janos. In Diamond, she is the 6th worst god after Janos. And in Masters, even though it's a small sample size, she is also the worst goddess. We'll talk more about Nox in the future because I think her stats are very interesting overall, but to briefly summarize her main issue at the moment, it's that a lot of her whole potential relies on hitting a combo of 2 abilities, and you can't really use them independently to still get the full effect. And it is relatively easy to counter, and her ultimate also is somewhat hard to fully apply in a teamfight depending on the situation. Her CDR-focused playstyle also doesn't benefit from the current build meta. I don't think we'll see all of these gods being buffed in the future, but I think at least some of them will need some nerfs, and some may be more acceptable in this situation or may just shift with the next coming meta. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to the sub button and maybe the bell, especially if you want to hear more about Nox as well in more detail in the future. Gotta make the video on that. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.